Welcome to Design Thinking Games, a fantasy and user experience podcast. Each episode, your podcast hosts, Tim Broadwater and Michael Schofield, will examine the player experience of board games, pen and paper role-playing games, live-action games, mobile games, and video games. You can find every episode, including this one, on your podcatcher of choice and on the web at designthinkinggames.com.
On my journey in trying to level up as a game master, I enjoy taking Dungeons and Dragons way more seriously than you should. So over the last year and a half, the pandemic has really given me a great opportunity to find some writers that I like and read them. There's one who I like quite a bit. His name is Justin Alexander. He writes I think a simple WordPress blog called The Alexandrian. He wrote about this method of designing or developing a story called the 3-clue rule that I'm totally in love with, and I just wanted to throw in your direction and get your thoughts. You cool with that?
Yeah, so what is the elevator pitch, the 2-sentence version of what's the 3-clue rule?
Of course, that's exactly like the hardest part here. So assuming this is an elevator in a large building, here's what I got. The 3-clue rule is a technique for solving sort of the narrative problem of how characters get from one mystery to another without railroading them. By railroad, I mean specifically, if we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, but we can think, I'm sure, of many different systems and games where this happens, even books where as a player, regardless of your intentions, you are guided directly, beat by beat by beat, through a story.
So like a linear progression, like a linear story.
Totally
when people say
linear,
it's
yeah.
linear narrative or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the 3-clue rule is trying to provide just a little bit of framework for folks who want to tell a story that isn't linear. The thing with whether they're developing a sandbox, again, like in Dungeons and Dragons, or it's some other video game or whatever, suddenly being able to tell like a cohesive story in a world or a scenario where people can go in any direction they want suddenly becomes an exponentially difficult problem to write for.
Yeah, I actually don't know of anyone, and maybe this is just, I'm kind of wondering about the percentage of players, right? But does anyone actually like a linear story that literally just is literally that you walk through and you're not really changing your direction, like no matter what you're doing? Yeah. I mean, you're still going to the same pieces. To me, that makes me think very much of The Last of Us or The Last of Us 2, because essentially in that system, and what I call it is like map locking, but essentially hey, you go through this building, and now once you go to this building, you are now in this area that has, let's say, a convenience store or whatever, and there's literally only one way out of the building. Or this area. So you're like locked in these 3D zone maps,
Sure.
And even though it seems like a world, but it's literally just like, here's this 3D container. It's like funny walls that you can't climb over or buildings that you can't climb.
Right.
So it's enforced, right? And there's only one way out. Now you can sneak your way through it. You can kill all the people. You can run through and slaughter them, or you can snipe them or whatever. But I mean, essentially, you're locked in a map and you have to go to the next. And I think like that's how the story works the same way. No decisions I make in the story change anything, right? And the biggest thing that people hate about Last of Us is how it forces you, or railroads you,
Sure.
quote unquote, into these difficult decisions. So yeah, I don't know how many people actually like linear. Apparently some do, I guess.
Right. And so with a linear game, I think you can design like really specific experiences that are mind-blowing. Perhaps this gives you more opportunity to really like focus on like excellent dialogue or really polished gameplay. You jump in. I just got out of a D&D game, so like I'm thinking about modules, and you have a really cool scenario that you can plan the shit out of because people are gonna get there eventually, right? So I think there's definitely benefit to it, and of course you can have a spectrum of good to bad. I imagine Last of Us is way closer to like the good end of the spectrum.
That's like the number one thing that people complain about, but also love about The Last of Us, is because, and I'm sorry if you did not play the game, this is a spoiler alert, but essentially in the end of the first game, I won't use the second one because it's rather new, but what people love but hate about it is that Joel, the main character, has no other option in the end. Like, you can wait it out and the timer goes down and there's a ticker, and nothing ever bad happens. But you kind of have to. You're forced to kill the doctors and save Ellie. You know what I mean? And people hate that. And 2's the same way in the end, but I'm not going to kind of ruin to it. So half the audience loves being railroaded, and forcing the player to make a difficult decision in that kind of example. Whereas other people hated it because they're like, no, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. Even in the context of the story, I wouldn't have done that, But anyways, in regards, so we know what linear is. What about the 3 clues?
Well, so to design something that's non-linear, you have a pretty difficult path ahead of you. It becomes really difficult to craft something meaningful around there. So if you want a sandbox with a really good story is way more difficult to do. So the 3 clue rule is proposing a system, and it's just this really kind of principle more than anything to help guide players from situation to situation without railroading, without pulling them along artificially, right?
They cannot make any progress whatsoever unless they go do X and specifically X.
Well, yeah.
So is it like clues that are in the world then?
Yeah, exactly.
And then...
So imagine, I think one of the examples I really like is imagine a Sherlock Holmes story, right? Where there is a complex, so mysteries are a really good case here, but I think we can see that this could apply to beyond that genre. But you have some sort of mystery, nay conspiracy, that requires a lot of deductions to fall into place before you can even come to that aha moment. Now, what Sherlock himself does is wanders into a room and sees everything there, plucks the correct deduction out of the ether, and is able to kind of move on. But the reality is again, from dungeon master to dungeon master, if you create a similar kind of story where pieces of the puzzle become clear over time, the reality is your players, or you as a player, are gonna miss all of the clues. So the idea here, the 3 clue rule is legit this. For any conclusion you want your player characters to make, include at least 3 clues. And Justin Alexander actually explains why 3. Because the player characters will probably miss the first, ignore the second, and misinterpret the third before making some incredible leap of logic that gets them where you wanted them to go all along. And then it's kind of a joke, but it's the idea that if you have the story where to get to point C, they have to get to point B, which requires they get to point A. That's fine if you want to guide them hardcore into that direction. But if you want to make it feel like a world where they have agency, what if they go to C first?
I feel like this is literally the thing that every good GM, or DM or storyteller plans for, and then it's always getting not railroaded, but always getting kind of thrown off track by the players because they're real, and people. It goes to something where it says it needs to so create the parameters in which they can understand, which I think is what I'm understanding from the three clue rule, as opposed to, railroading ABC, like you're saying. This, when you gave the example of the D&D module, it makes me think of the Pathfinder and Starfinder modules. Like, in the majority of them, there's a Starfinder one that I'm thinking of right now that I ran recently as a GM, and you kind of crash on a planet, and you're trying to figure out why you crashed, where to go, and what to do. And through a combination of, you're in a swamp when you crash, and it's like, well, if you even just physically walk around, you're going to, there's an A, B, and C, right?
Sure.
3 clue rule. One is like this, you see these elementals attacking this weather station. And then this other one is you hear, you see these weird electrical portal things that you can kind of investigate. But then another one is then you hear at some point a yell and you respond to it and you save a person. And the person ends up leading you to a village of their place, but then by understanding that there's a weird temporal like electric storm going on, that's what kind of got your ship crashed, and this is how it's affecting the local like wildlife, right? And so you kind of get the story, but it doesn't matter if you go ABC or CBA or
exactly.
CA, yeah.
No, that's and that's probably an example of like how a well done or well designed narrative takes place. And someone probably followed, whether they called it or not, this 3 clue rule. The idea is like, okay, well, instead of imagining a scenario like, oh, I need these players to deduct from the crime scene, you flip it around a little bit and you say to yourself, well, I need the players to conclude that the criminal was a large furry rabbit. Okay, right? Yeah. So and so instead of saying like they're going to discover that it was a large furry rabbit in this specific scenario, you just define what they need to know. And from there, the 3 clue rule is like, well,
they found fur on the crime scene, or they talked to a bystander that saw a big rabbit in a street or something. Yeah, so you drop it in 3 places.
Exactly. And so the way your narrative design looks like in the game, if you were to like map this out on a piece of paper, is instead of an outline where like first step 1, then step 2, you have like a whole bunch of dots, right? Little like little nav points on your paper HUD, or nodes. These just kind of like little chunks. And the idea is that like wherever you place clues for one conclusion, there is evidence for other conclusions from that node. But it just shows that like your story can become really complex in this way. You're still guiding the story, you're still guiding the players, but it gives the illusion of agency, I think.
Free choice or interaction.
Yeah.
There's it's interesting you said kind of nodes, because I think, what we're really talking about is like this node or this package, right? Where you're putting these things together, and the packages can exist on their own, and no matter what time or order they happen in, they find one when they go to a museum, or they get access to another one the next day by a kid they talk to on the street, or whatever it is. It's this kind of modular thing that can move around, and it specifically makes me think of how we have that kind of in design, in software, modular design, object or components, reusable components. There's also, which I don't know if you've heard of it before, but have you ever heard of OOUX, or object-oriented UX?
Yeah, it's super popular.
Yeah, I think it's Sophia Prater. And if Sophia, if you ever listen to us, and I hope you do, but if I mispronounce your name, I'm sorry. But I actually will say I get your weekly email that comes to me that is literally kind of all the cool applications of object-oriented UX. I actually used it about a year ago. I was working with a client, and the client was a school counselor, and he wanted to apply for this grant that kind of gave this demonstration of how an app could work to help ease the job, and then, get backing so they could put it and offer it free to school systems and whatever. long story short, like how object-oriented UX works is that you have these content components that are like main objects, core content, metadata, nested objects. And it's really those kind of pieces. And then you kind of identify the best example that she uses is if you think of like you're using an app that is a recipe app or a cooking app, right? So you have a recipe. That recipe has ingredients. There's a chef that made this recipe and submitted it, and then there's reviews, which is like users like Yelping or giving it 4 stars or whatever, writing comments. How can we design an experience in such a way that is so organic that a user can kind of fly from recipe to ingredient back to recipe to cook to ratings? You see what the cook rated. I want to see what other things the cook wrote, or like see if users like this particular recipe, or if they gave it their own twist. So I kind of did the same thing with kids in school. Who's their teacher? Who are their parents? What grade they're in? So you could kind of fluidly navigate around to get what you need.
It sounds like it's like the 3-clue rule plus more clues, some of which are ultra obvious, right? And I think that's one of those. Like Justin Alexander is just sort of making the point that look, your players aren't Sherlock Holmes, so what he calls it is proactive clues. He's actually sort of proactive clues, aka bash them on the head with it.
What it makes me think of is honestly like Detroit Being Human, or like Heavy Rain, which you talked about before, which is like, hey, something went on here, or Wolf Among Us. Shake down this place. This place was shake down, or something. Like, go in there, and dude, you can look at everything and interact with everything. And there's probably 40 clues in there, but you really only need to build up the percentage, like 3, right? To like,
sure.
Oh, you don't have to look at it really anything else. I mean, you can if you want, but
that's the
you got the gist.
That's the other part of the spectrum of this kind of like world, like narrative design, right? So it's not just like, hey, when you come to the conclusion, go straight to it. But in some cases, like the next beat of the story is like locked either behind some kind of like meter. It's like, oh, you have to complete this 30% before you can continue on, which I think is supposed to simulate get it, like figuring it out, like getting all the clues that you actually need. But in some cases that's totally locked. In app design, right, you have things like, oh, you can't do this until you do this, right? And it's guided. It's sort of like this breadcrumb style of design.
So you mentioned something too before, maybe in a previous episode or when we were talking about this, Gumshoe. What is that?
Yeah, so that describes that style of game design or design that is I think like super like the 3-clue rule is supposed to like solve for that, and specifically I think it was named after all of these Sherlock Holmes style of games, specifically mysteries as well. Did you ever play any of those like first person, almost like point and click adventure Sherlock Holmes games, like Sherlock Holmes and I don't know if this is the real title, but there's one where it's like Sherlock Holmes versus like fucking Dracula, and like
no, really?
Oh yeah,
no,
yeah. Oh, they get weird. There's like Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper. But I mean, you can play like regular mysteries as well.
Yeah, I think the Sierra games, which is the
that's where
Ken and Roberta Williams, where they have
comes from. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I've done, which actually was a mystery. The Colonel's Bequest, the Laura Bow mysteries. I think there was 2 or 3 of those games. The second one was the Dagger of Amun-Ra or something.
Sure.
But they're a mystery game that is where you can click on the mouse to move around, but then you have to type in, look, open, closet, and then hit enter. And then
sure. So this Gumshoe thing. Let me read this briefly. It's just a couple paragraphs. For the Gumshoe system used in games. By Robin D. Laws decided to get rid of the concept of needing to find clues. And in each scene of an investigation, there is a clue. It is automatically assumed that the investigators will find it.
So all you had to do was just go there?
Yeah,
then?
It's like in the case of the Gumshoe system, the need to find the clues and make the correct deduction is handled mechanically with the players committing points from their character skills to receive increasingly accurate hints, right? The gumshoe system is supposed to just describe, which, like, you know, I think of, like, when I love these Sherlock Holmes games. They're fun, but there's no mystery to it, because all it is about finding the part of the room that you're in that is clickable, and suddenly the deduction, or the clue at least, literally becomes a line in a dashboard, right, or in your notebook or something like that. And the game is to take 3 clues and draw the correct lines between them, and then you get a deduction. And so it's I think it's specifically this idea that first you are going to be in the right place at the right time to get the clues, but then you can use a mechanical solution to make it more likely that the player will figure it out. So yeah.
There's did you ever play like the King's Quest or Space Quest or Police Quest? Or
I played King's Quest. Yeah, man, classic.
Yeah, so the one that is the Colonel's Bequest, which is the Laura Bow series, the first one. Laura Bow is this, I think, student that it goes to some. She's an English student, I think, but she goes to college somewhere in like Louisiana or something, and then she goes with her friend home for the weekend to visit for a family reunion. And they're like, okay, and so they get on a swamp boat and they go out there, and they have it. And at dinner, like, the Colonel, who's the head of the family, and everyone meets there, and it's like Southern gentry, but then that French Creole kind of, Louisiana bayou mystery,
Welcome,
whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, everyone is Gambit.
Yeah. And so essentially, he announces that he's writing everyone out of the will, that you're all ungrateful brats and you're all horrible people, and he's not giving anyone his money. And that's what happens at the family reunion. Good times. Thanksgiving, I guess. Anyways. And then that night he gets murdered.
Oh my God, who did it?
Well, then, yeah. And so it's this game where you're clicking around with the mouse and you're investigating and clues, and you're trying to search for fingerprints, and you're eavesdropping in hallways to behind walls to like see secret conversations. And then there's like all this stuff that happens. The only thing that keeps the momentum going is the clock keeps turning. You're just trying to get to the morning, because the police will come in the morning. You can't leave because the swamp is risen or whatever. And so there's events that you can miss. And so it's really hard to get all sides of the stories. And at the end, it gives you this percentage, which I thought was amazing, that when I beat the game finally, which was so hard to do, it was just like, oh, you got a 45% correct.
Wow. So you potentially came to the wrong conclusion?
Yeah, so kind of what happens, to your point, is that you can finger the wrong person.
Wow.
That's horrible. I said that. I won't say. You can blame the wrong person. Yeah. You can blame the wrong person. And then the cops will arrest someone who's, incorrect. And it'll just say this plucky thing that's like, oh, it's a shame you didn't find the right person. Or it's a shame you didn't see and it would just give you these sentences at the end of the game that said, oh, it's a shame you didn't spend more time in the parlor, or or shame, where it would just tell you like, oh, what did I miss in the parlor, and then you would and the replay value was crazy. But in that regards, there's like hundreds of clues.
Sure.
So what do you think? I mean, I think that's a great example of a game that is kind of this non-linear kind of 3-clue or gumshoe kind of thing, to where you're trying to piece together. Do you have a game that specifically speaks to you in that kind of genre?
You got me thinking about all these Sherlock Holmes games. I played them all. They're all like this. There's an old game. I need to find it. I kept the CD-ROM, even though I can't play it on anything, because it's one of my favorite games of all times. It was like a Titanic game, which was a whodunit on board the Titanic the night that it sank. But I love these style of games which lets you complete it even if you're wrong. Relatively recently, in the last 10 years. LA Noire did something similar, which was a game where you're a detective and you have to read the person's face as you question them and come to a conclusion. And boy, I got a lot of them wrong and sent a lot of the wrong people to jail, right? But it's just one of those things which is fascinating.
I have played Gabriel Knight before. I'm not sure if you've played those.
We should talk entire episode about Gabriel Knight, specifically the second one, which is is it like Gabriel Knight and the Beast Within, or Gabriel Knight and
The Beast Within, and I think he goes to visit a family in Scotland, and he inherits a castle or something.
I promise you, I'm not looking this up, but I love this game so much. Gabriel Knight and The Beast Within is specifically my favorite one because in Gabriel Knight's 1 and 2, 1 for technical reasons and 3, I meant 1 and 3, and 3 for stylistic reasons, they were both graphic games. But in Gabriel Knight 2, they had this kind of weird blend of video game and real human actors that was a thing in the late 90s or the mid 90s or whatever.
Wouldn't they video them and record their audio, and then they would turn the video into a
GIF almost? Yeah, it's and so you would see actors act out the scene, and then they would be these static cutouts of actual photographs that had slight walking mechanics. It was pretty bananas, but at the time it was great. All that to say, Gabriel Knight goes to Germany because he's either inherited or occupying a castle from his family, the Ritters.
I said Scotland. Yeah, it's Germany.
I remember because you had to go through there's the main a main through point there is the story of an old Barovian count, something like that.
Oh wow!
It's so and you have to go to Munich and stuff like that.
I remember that the Gabriel Knight, like the first one and the second one, and I'm sure there may be more. I don't know, but basically Gabriel Knight, the first one was that Sins of the Father, I think.
Sins of the Father, too.
And he's a bookstore and occultist.
That's what
this is what I always thought was cool, because he was a bookstore owner and an occultist who was also a private detective.
Right.
And he so it's kind of weird, but it's kind of cool. You know what I mean? So you're thinking like Friday the 13th, the TV series
it's
vibe.
Very Lovecraftian, right? Because often like Lovecraft characters or in like Call of Cthulhu, it's like, oh, this is a librarian who has a deep knowledge of the occult.
Yeah, and I mean, he has interactions with New Orleans, and he goes to Lafayette Cemetery and Pontchartrain Park, I think, and then there's murders, and he's being hired individually, but then he has to, of course, he shows up, and there's cops there, and he has an interaction with the cops, and there's voodoo, and it's Mardi Gras. So yeah, it's really cool series, but it has a lot of that.
It has a deep mystery too.
You have to research, and you get fingerprints at points, and like you do, it's like definitely a detective
I can't
game.
remember if Gabriel Knight gate kept you though. I mean, I think I because in your earlier example with like the Colonel's Bequest. Or in these Sherlock Holmes games, like you can finish them wrong, but you can still finish them.
You can't proceed in Gabriel Knight.
But I think you can't proceed, right?
Yeah, so Colonel's Bequest was like the night marches on.
Yeah.
And so if it's 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning or 2 in the morning, whatever, I mean, it's going to happen, and you either get information or you don't. And then at the end of the night, the cops come, or at dawn, the cops come, and they kind of ask you who did it, and you can choose anyone. You know, but in Gabriel Knight, like you kind of every day keeps going by, and it's like there's I think there's an overall time ticker that something bad can happen, but then every day you can drive around. You can go to the Pontchartrain Park, or you can go to Lafayette Cemetery, you can go to the library, you can go to your store, you can kind of do anything, and it's just like as the time ticker goes by, I think you just can't do things unless you ask the right questions and get the right clues that prompt those questions, you know.
I love that. I like I mean I think those dark picture anthology games do something similar where you can there's a couple instances where you miss an opportunity to have this conversation or progress in this specific way because you dilly-dallied or you went the other way. I love these things. Yeah.
This makes me think of the board game Clue.
Oh,
it's very
too.
It's a super good game, and there's many versions of it. And I love the movie is even hilarious. Yes. But is even more hilarious.
Yeah, I can't do it, Tim Curry.
What did you do?
Murder. There's nothing at all.
I don't know. I just remember Madeline Kahn and the line where she's like, "Flames on the side of my face, burning flames." Yeah. Anyways, but in Clue, you're just trying to find the weapon, the location, and who did it, and all you're doing is literally asking everyone like a detective would, It's but I don't know, this conversation just about detective games and this genre and then the different ways that you can get through the story, but then also if you're supposed to find something out over the course of the story, like in a detective game, it's interesting mechanics, and then having these things set up to where they're like separate or like modular, like we were saying, where they're just self-contained things that you can move around. Find out and experience and be wrong if you're trying to figure out something, or maybe go to the wrong place and miss something.
What a hard type of game to design. Right? I mean, I think that's the point. I mean, this, like, to do them well is super difficult. To do a mystery well, hard. To do a sandbox well that guides you through a story, pretty hard.
Yeah, so like in UX, I mean, we think of like findability and discoverability, right? Mm-hmm. So especially on a website or web application or enterprise software application or whatever, but can the user get to where they need to or find where it is? But then can they, by just interacting with the system, organically discover things that help them and they didn't see before? And you just got the user or the player just needs to get in there and start moving, right? That's what they want to do. But when you apply that model of findability and discoverability, or that concept to, kind of the narrative in the game, or what you're trying to find out in the game.
Like that is a discoverability thing, right? It's because what you're trying to guide is conclusion. You want the players to discover the next beat of the story. There's probably like a really good rule there too in designing information architecture, and you definitely need people to be able to find X.
Information architecture is all its own thing. I mean, it's almost like we think maybe just navigation and card sorting, right? And card sorting making dendrograms to this is how you should group information because this is how our user would do it. And then, it's a lot of nuanced kind of thing.
There's probably something there where, like an application of like the 3 clue rule to say, like information.
Well, everyone always says the 3 clicks, right?
Yeah, 3. Yeah, exactly. It's like you should be able to get to every part of a website or a web service within 3 clicks from anywhere within that web service. I mean, that, like, I'm sure clearly easier said than done, but that kind of, you can imagine if you were to like map this all out on a 2-dimensional plane with crime scene like strings like drawn between like thumbtacks, that suddenly, a service of any significant size that adheres to that principle has a lot of potential throughput, which is probably a greatly designed system.
Thank you for listening to the Design Thinking Games podcast. To connect with your hosts, Michael or Tim, please go to designthinkinggames.com, where you can request topics, ask questions, or see what else is going on. Until next time, game on.